The war in Iran is dominating headlines with the impact on shipping and trade high up the agenda. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with the latest chat about geopolitics and trade episode, and I'm joined by Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT. Now, while Punit normally hosts our geopolitics and trades episodes, today he's the one in the hot seat, and you'll be hearing his views on the regional conflict in the Middle East and its impact on global trade. So, Punit, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's good to be on the other side of the conversation. I would say I would have expected a discussion like this to happen in better circumstances, but we are where we are. Before we even start the podcast, I would just like to say thank you very much to all the seafarers who are actually in the line of fire. Shipping has always been a casualty, and we have seen that this is very personal for me because Pressure Shipping is the first company that I started my career in, and one of their ships has actually been hit with 3 seafarers missing. So a huge tribute and a salute to the seafarers who keep these things moving in most difficult circumstances. Another example that you can see today with all the things that's happening in the Iran war.
Indeed, and that's a very heartfelt thing that needs emphasizing with the industry we're in. Coming to what we're going to be talking about today, the whole sort of global trade aspect of this, we've got a lot to get through here. So I'm going to get straight into this. Punit, to set the scene, could you describe the changing nature of the region over the years and the US's role in the oil trade?
Yes, Marcus, I think this is very fascinating. I always say history is very important to understand what's happening today and what might happen in future as well. So Middle East has always been oil rich since it got nationalized post the 1970s. And after that, you actually had still a big role to play. Then you had the embargo and a whole bunch of things that actually followed after that. Americans built a strategic reserve, and they still have that reserve, which is being used even today in such this crisis as we speak. But at the same time, the Middle East also grew and connected with the entire global environment. In the 1970s and pre-1970s and even 1980s, it was US that was dominating the relationships with the Middle East countries, all the way from Pakistan to Iraq, Kuwait, down the line. And then, of course, it supported Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. And then, of course, Iraq fell off of favor. Saddam Hussein, the second Gulf War happened. And then you had the Afghanistan, you had the 9/11, and the equation changed completely. So the region has always been pivotal. It's always been close to the Americans over the years. Americans have been big actors there, except in Afghanistan, where Russia was a big actor. But after the 1990s and 2000, once China started getting more involved in the global space, you can see that Middle East is very closely connected with other countries in the world as well. Whether it's the growing India, whether it is the African influence, or whether it is influence or a relationship with China, a whole bunch of relationships have opened up in this multilateral, multipolar world. That is why a war today in the Middle East is not just America's war as the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War was. It is the world's war, whether you like it or not. I don't say it's a world war, but it's world's war. It's the war of the world affecting the world at the end of the day. That's the nature which has changed dramatically. Another thing which is important to remember is that in 2010, during Obama administration, US lifted the export ban on crude oil. Since then, shale oil has become a big player, has maintained the prices of the oil in pretty tough times and volatile times. Today, shale oil means that America is not just a customer of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, it's also a competitor to Saudi Arabia and Middle East. That relationship change means that the war has also taken a different perspective because you are actually having competing interests, but also customer interests in the mix. And that is why America, on one hand, is probably bleeding from what's going on in some ways. But at the other hand, over $100 a barrel oil price is a bonanza for its shale oil producers and exporters, something that they would never have actually seen before 2010 when the ban was in place. So today's war and today's Middle East influence is very different, and the region itself has changed its color dramatically over the last 20 years. That's why the war is significant for us. and everybody's paying great attention to it, not just the American and its allies, but every single country in the world which is impacted by this. That's the difference.
Thanks. I think that really sort of explains why this has this global importance. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Now, you talked about sort of the changing nature of things. Now, I think one of the things that sort of characterized the landscape geopolitically in recent years has been the rise of misinformation. When you kind of look back from the sort of Gulf Wars 1 and 2 to the current one we're seeing with Iran, how has that changed things?
I think the social media angle has been a huge push. When the president of America is more accessible or more visible on Truth Social than in White House, there's a big change in the way the wars are fought. I'm happy to see at least Pentagon and others are actually having briefings in the proper traditional way, but most of the time, the president's information comes from Truth Social. And that also means that, in the recent times, the Iranian president also has put on X the three conditions that he needs to have a discussion to try and de escalate the war. I mean, this is a social media age. But that also means that a lot of information can be then manipulated. Algorithmically, you can actually try and manipulate what data and what tweets and what relevant information and misinformation in some cases goes to the audience, and the audience react accordingly, whether it is a question of individuals or groups or organizations. All of them are informed and misinformed using algorithms and targeted algorithms. At the same time, we also need to understand that artificial intelligence is generating videos, and there's a lot of deep fake aspect videos coming in as well. So a lot of reactionary aspects is not possible. I was speaking to one of the managing directors of a shipping company, and he said this time the war is different only because our customers are asking us questions based on some completely random fake AI videos saying, "Is this your ship?" And then, like, it becomes a huge challenge. So, this is where I think the war here has become very different, because anybody can pick up a video of a normal ship belonging to a normal shipping company in decent, normal waters trading, and suddenly inject a missile attack on it, and make a video out of it. And then you can actually end up in a huge crisis, even though none of it exists. On the other hand, you might actually get less information on the real issues which are happening out there. So this war is more tricky to handle. And that is why you are again re-emphasizing with this war that ultimately it's the human beings who have to really act with each other. They have to pick up the phone, talk to each other, solve problems. Let's reiterate the fact that human relationships are still the foundation of both war and peace at the end of the day. And this war reiterates that, like any other war in the past, this is so different from that particular set of wars. It reiterates the human aspects, and it reconfirms that AI might be good, but it can also be bad. Let's try and sidestep that and get back to your traditional way of managing relationships, whether it's political or whether it's personal.
So, a whole new set of challenges, really, on top of on the war itself.
I agree.
Now, this is a podcast entitled Chat About Geopolitics and Trade. So, drilling down into the economic impact, what are the direct trades that you see are going to be impacted by this, Punit?
So I did a presentation to the Singapore Management University early last week, and I was talking to them about this, and some of them, or nearly all of them, were aware of the fact that the export commodities, which is directly impacted, are of course the energy hydrocarbon exports, which is the most pronounced. In some cases, like Iraq, Oman, over 90% to 99% of their export revenue comes from oil, which is crazy, because at the end of the day, when you have that kind of an impact and suddenly you go from 100 to 0, you really have a challenge, right? So there's knock-on impacts which we'll talk about in a minute, but the very direct impact is oil and gas, especially from Qatar. At the same time, what most students were not aware of is that nearly 80% of the food in the region is imported. So, because the Straits of Hormuz are effectively closed up, these foodstuffs cannot reach. And that is an existential problem, That is an existential crisis. If food is literally food, I mean, you need food to survive, and you can't grow it, and you can't really have a crazy amount of feed, stock of it, because most of it is perishable stuff as well. So this is a lifeline challenge which the Gulf is having, and there's a big direct impact. On top of that, there are immediate byproducts of the oil or energy side. Fertilizers, urea made from ammonia. You also have sulfur coming out of and pet coke coming out of oil as a byproduct. These are all commodities which are traded globally and sold worldwide. And now suddenly the supply sources are drying up very quickly. In some cases, the supply sources are hit by missiles, and therefore they might be out of commission for a longer time. So these are pretty direct impacts that the region has taken because of that. Another very interesting direct impact is aluminum. 60% of aluminum is actually still sitting with the Chinese. They have capacity. But the Qatar Alum, Emirates Aluminum, Dubal, Alba Aluminum Bahrain, they are all essentially swing producers, and aluminum requires heavy amount of energy to come from alumina to aluminum. I mean, you're really talking about things which are so high in terms of content that it's completely crazy. And that is the kind of impact. Now with the aluminum scenario going away, we have a huge problem as to where this next supply space is going to come from. So, in my mind, there are direct impacts by these commodities. Their supply sources are battered, and some of them are actually existential challenges which are there as well. So, I will not even talk about knock on impacts, but direct trade that I actually suffered in just these commodity sectors is enough to kind of get both the dry bulk and the tankers into some serious challenges going forward.
Yeah, no, certainly. And actually, when you look at the container side, I'm seeing some really sort of inventive solutions to try and get into the region now. You've got a couple of MSC and CMAC CGM sort of saying, you go from Asia via the Cape of Good Hope into the East Med, overland through Turkey into Iraq.
Wow.
It's just shipping by land. So that's, again, very convoluted ways of meeting this problem. Anyway, you touched on indirect impacts there. Perhaps you can tell our listeners a bit more about those.
Yeah, I think the knock-on impacts are being felt across the board. I mean, first of all, these products, which are byproducts of the energy, are being used in factories. So, pet coke, for example, is used heavily in cement factories to generate energy as well. It is also, of course, was being used a lot by the plants, the aluminum plants in Middle East itself. So just to give you an idea, I was talking about energy that is required, and just to put it in perspective, to basically produce 1 ton of aluminum from alumina, the amount of energy that requires powers an average home for 1.5 to 2 years. 2 years. So we are talking about heavily intensive energy spaces. So a lot of these products were basically being looked at for internal use and also external use, because a lot of the petroleum coke was also going out to China and other places to generate energy, because you need very high energy levels. Sulfur eventually becoming sulfuric acid. It's also being used in lots of other areas. Fertilizers are used in agricultural space to grow crops. And here lies the problem: crops have a seasonality aspect to it. You cannot grow crops in your own sweet time. You need to actually time it according to what the weather is and the seasons are. There's a sowing season and there is a harvesting season. If the sowing season doesn't have the fertilizers available at the right time, we have a problem. Oman and India have got a joint venture urea production, which has been pretty much the majority of the supplies for Indian fertilizers come from Oman. And now even Oman is under attack. And there are ships which are seriously having challenges transporting these aspects. What are the other knock-on impacts are the energy challenges. The lack of gas, LPG, is creating issues with restaurants remaining open, and restaurants are closing down for half a day in India. Offices are shut down for half a week in Pakistan and India. These are all challenges which are creating economic impacts and inefficiencies and slowdown at the end of the day. This will get reflected in global GDP, whether we like it or not. These effects are going to last countries who are heavily dependent on these things. The other thing which is important, as I mentioned in an article in Seatrade itself, is Asia imports more than 85% of the energy from the Gulf. And the Straits of Hormuz is, as I mentioned, as existential artery rather than just a trade lane, right? For Asia, this is a huge impact. And why I mentioned this specifically is because Asian growth space is kind of holding up the global growth more or less. The rest of the countries, whether it's America, whether it's Europe, and even African countries, are not the biggest contributor to global growth space. It's the Asian countries which are contributing. If they are hit because of the fact that 85% of the energy supplies are now in jeopardy, this is going to have a knock on impact on producers and consumers globally as well. So, buckle up for a rough ride, whether we like it or not. This is going to have long term impacts.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned there about I think it's the LPG shortage in India for like the restaurants. I'm amazed how quickly that has happened. It's what, 2 weeks?
Yes, unlike the IEA having a strategic reserve of millions of barrels of oil, most of the people have, in fact, most of the countries used to put out posters or publicity saying we have actually pioneered and adopted just in time solutions. Now, the problem is the just in time has now become just in case, and just in case has become no supply whatsoever. So now just grab wherever you can find your supplies from. Interestingly, China has been very quiet in this discussion, and China has actually been benefiting from some of the pipelines that it actually built in the last 10 years and 15 years with Turkmenistan, with Russia, with Central Asia. This is the time for BRI to be tested. Honestly, the Belt and Road Initiative is not just a pathway of the old Silk Road, it is a link of multiple infrastructure projects which China has built in cooperation with those countries on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now is the time for them to use these pathways, these linkages to try and fire their energy needs and keep the energy needs going. Because without that, and especially with Iran out of action, it's a huge challenge for them. I would not be surprised if they actually decide to take a land route and eventually get some of that stuff going through the land as well. But it's a long way down for them to manage that space. But desperate time calls for desperate measures. Yeah.
Indeed. I'm going to come back to you actually on the point you made about the BRI there. But before I do, the whole sort of green energy picture as well. Now, that's something that the Trump administration has kind of managed to sort of push down, particularly, wind and so forth. But as we see oil and gas prices rising, over $100 a barrel for crude, could this actually spark a revival for renewables?
Absolutely. There's nothing more powerful than an economic rationale to try and take decision, right? Most of the decisions are based on pure economics. Some of them are based on, let's say, personal ideologies and stuff like that. But most of the time, when economics really dictate the decision making, it also tends to kind of have a stable execution. In this case, I think we have to keep in mind that if renewables start getting traction once again, every aspect associated with renewables, whether it is the kind of raw materials that is needed, whether the fact that the electric vehicles are coming back. I'll give you a personal example. I drive an electric vehicle. I'm not saying that we are not impacted in Singapore as yet by the war and what's happening. We will be impacted. But the fact is, I don't have to go to a petrol pump to fuel my vehicle or power my vehicle is a big difference, right? In terms of what it is. And those kind of pump prices, which are creating huge issues in America, maybe it's time for them to wake up and say, let's try and see if we can build electric vehicles. Let's try and get back on track a little bit with electric vehicles because these pump prices are simply very, very difficult to manage. And these kind of things will actually drive some of these decisions. Whether it actually turns it for good for a long term, I don't know. But it definitely will start make people think that it's time for us to go back to the renewable story and also think a little bit about climate in because of that, because obviously you're then trying to reduce emissions in that specific area as well. But having said that, make no mistake about it, there is a trade which is actually linked to it. The spodumene, for example, which actually is predominantly used to produce lithium, is a massive trade now from Australia to China. And that's because China is producing electric batteries. If other places in the world start producing electric battery, spodumene will also start moving from Australia and other places into those countries. So wherever the supply, wherever the demand will eventually spark for renewable related stuff, could be solar panels that India starts making And that solar panel demand is actually having certain raw materials for it. But also, container traffic will change massively because solar panels need to be shipped out. Britain has pledged to try and go back into, let's say, the ground level renewable projects that it tries to set up. And it wants to import more solar panels both from China and India. US wants to stop the imports of solar panels, so UK is starting to step in and take some of the demand away. All these realignment of trades are going to impact bulk, dry bulk, as well as container traffic if this picks up as well. And oil prices or hydrocarbon prices being high is a great way for you to sell the renewable story once again, which I think is very important.
That's very interesting. Now, one of the big producers of renewable energy is China. And you mentioned before there about the test case for the BRI in all of this. So, who do you see as the key beneficiaries of this war?
So this is very interesting. I've been following this from multiple perspectives, and one would think, even if one would assume that it was Israel who kickstarted this entire conflict this time around, and US kind of kowtowed along and decided to help them along, and now they are embroiled in this massive conflict. It's not the Americans, the Israelis who are gaining from this at all. The Americans are actually having high pump prices, inflation, which is going to create a challenge. The assumption or the dream of reducing interest rates looks a little bit more difficult now. Israel is, of course, suffering personally as well, and it is creating challenges for it in multiple spaces. The beneficiaries, ironically, in this case, is Russia. I was reading a report saying that it's actually pulling in another $150 million a day because of the rising oil prices. And it is actually now suddenly back in the business. The American government has given it a quota or a general quota exemption for those ships which actually have been loaded before the March 12th to be able to sell that oil to anybody without worrying about sanctions. Now, this means that the Russians who actually were, struggling to, let's say, put some dollars together or monies together with their oil supplies, only selling it to friends, now can sell it to everybody in the market because it's all available. And they might have well loaded a dark fleet full of ships waiting to actually go out there and sell it out there. So, Russia, massive beneficiary. And Russia is now leveraging its relationship with India and China, stepping up and saying, we are happy to supply the oil as well from our side. That's the one thing. Another beneficiary who has actually been very smart post Justin Trudeau's exit, Mark Carney's election in Canada, has been a complete sea change because he has been able to manage the Trump challenge a bit better by opening up Canada to the rest of the world. He has actually visited the ASEAN summit. Canada was never at the ASEAN summit. Canada never visited India, Indonesia, Asian countries, never had a visit from the European countries. The Indonesian president never visited Canada in the history of Indonesia. First time ever, you actually started getting these deals done. So Canada sits with, first of all, the oil that is already being supplied to Asia in slightly greater volume. It also wants to supply more to India because India needs more oil as well because Gulf is shut down. Also, on top of that, Canada has basically said that we're going to set up uranium deals with India. We're going to start working on the fact that if the pressure or the leverage or the negotiation challenges with America continue, we need to find alternate markets for all our resources. And we need to reduce our dependence on USA going forward. So I think because of the Venezuelan change dimension, America is sitting with a little bit more cushion or a buffer because it can actually bring Venezuelan crude to US to refine. At the same time, Venezuela was also threatening Guyana, and now with the Venezuelan threat gone, the Guyana oil also is now coming to America, which is why America may not be actually sitting and trying to get more Canadian oil or even might reduce Canadian imports. If that happens, Canada becomes a very big beneficiary of this crisis. It's going to become a swing supplier for energy, for grains, for a whole bunch of things, which can actually be a huge advantage going forward. US itself will benefit from the high oil prices, and the shale oil producers will obviously benefit from that. But overall, the population might feel challenged because for every drone that's costing $10,000-$15,000, allegedly for the Iranians, you have a Patriot missile intercepting, which costing $1 million. So 1 to 100 ratio. I don't know how much the Americans can actually survive with those kind of mechanics after a point of time. The last beneficiary is going to be BRICS. Alliances usually get tested in tough times. When things are really good and everybody is happy, efficient trades are happening, no problem. When crises are there, can China reach out to Brazil? Can China reach out to Russia, India, South Africa? And can the extended BRICS countries, which includes Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, some of them fighting each other in theory, and of course Ethiopia and Egypt, step up along with Indonesia now, step up their game and try and help each other with trades? Because now it's really not about trying to just get the pricing right, it's about getting the supply diversified as much as possible. These guys in BRICS Plus sit with a lot of gas, a lot of energy. Some of it is stuck in the Gulf, but a lot of it is available outside the Gulf as well. And we need to see those trades suddenly change. Intra BRIC trades is going to be a huge defining advantage if the bloc actually plays their cards well within themselves. And if they come out stronger, that's going to be a huge push towards de-dollarization as well, because this group is looking to try and look for an alternate or to dollar. If that happens, then America is in some serious challenges. So the real beneficiaries: Russia, Canada, and the BRICS as a whole.
That's actually a lot of changes. That's really quite wide ranging. Does this mean that the sort of global trade and relationships are going to be sort of forever changed by this war?
I would think so. As I said right in the beginning of the podcast, this war is different because the region has changed its color over the years. It has got global connections, and therefore it's actually got impact. Also, remember one thing that has changed. Although none of the Gulf countries, in spite of all the threats that they're giving to Iran, none of them have actually attacked Iran aggressively. They've not gone offensive. They've only been defending themselves till now, but they've been voicing their concerns that how can a fellow GCC country bomb and pound these countries, not just army bases and US facilities, but residential facilities. We saw this in Dubai, we saw this in Bahrain. Actually, their entire internal alignment has dramatically changed post this war. They don't want to be offensive because that would mean that they are actually coming on the side of Israel, which they may not want to be politically in general. But having said that, they will be very careful in terms of how they manage the space. I'll give you a interesting statistic that most of the business that was happening from Dubai, most of the business that was happening from Dubai was a de facto Iranian population which are basically doing Iranian business or Dubai business from the Iranian perspective. Herein lies the challenge. It was actually facilitating the financial means for Iran to actually do better business globally and get connected globally. Now they've severed that. These relationships will change the dynamics completely. It will also bring the middle powers up into a much greater role to play, because they will actually start saying, we don't depend on America because America can be very, very transactional. It can actually go and hit Iran again at any point of time. This can erupt again. How about we try and start building some linkages out there with other countries who can actually support us, and we find other ways to manage our challenges as well. So there's going to be a complete realignment of what strategic partners that Gulf countries are going to look for. Defense, they might still look for America, EU, and others, but trade, they will definitely be moving more towards China, towards Asia, because I don't think that the real business, the trade, is actually now left much in the Europe US space. It is predominantly in the Asian space, and the Gulf countries have now realized, especially after this, that their future lies with a different partner economically and different partner strategically and defense wise. They will need to split up their strategies to reflect the new realities. This is going to be very interesting when it ends, but we have no idea how and when it will end. I hope it ends soon, but I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel as yet.
Yes, that's a very big question, which I don't think anyone can answer. It is really interesting how you sort of mapped out that the overall changes here and the longer term impacts that are already kind of apparent. Thank you, Punit. I certainly personally have learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope our listeners have too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. And this is praying for things to actually cool down, especially the seafarers. No more injuries, no more suffering. Let's hope everybody is able to come out of this safe and sound. Prayers with everybody. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more with that. Thank you, Punit. Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode.